Nintendo is one of the big three gaming companies, alongside Sony and Microsoft. Their desire to innovate and countless beloved classics they've made over the years have truly made them an important part of American culture. Nintendo was founded in 1889 by Fushihiro Yamauchi. I have no clue if I pronounced that right. Nintendo started off making Japanese playing cards called Hanafuda cards. In 1933, the company was established as Yamauchi and Nintendo Co. In 1950, Hiroshi Yamauchi took the office as Nintendo president, and he's the man that turned Nintendo into what it is today. In 1951, the company's name was changed to Nintendo Playing Card Co. until 1963 when it was changed to just Nintendo after they started releasing board games. In 1966, Nintendo released its first toy, the Ultra Hand, and this turned Nintendo into a toy company. Nintendo continued to make toys until 1975, where they started to experiment with video games. None of these really took off until 1980, when Nintendo released the first line of Game & Watches. Game & Watches were LCD portable consoles that are kind of similar to calculators. Later on in 1980, Nintendo artist Shigeru Miyamoto designed Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong was Nintendo's first arcade success. And the main character of Donkey Kong, Jumpman, doesn't he look a bit familiar? In 1983, Nintendo released their first home console in Japan, the Famicom, and they wanted to bring the Famicom to North America, but there was one slight problem. In 1983, the video game market crashed due to overhyped Atari 2600 games that disappointed a lot of people. No one wanted to buy video games anymore. So Nintendo redesigned the Famicom into the NES, marketing it as not a video game console, but an entertainment system. They also included a robot called Rob, so that way they could market it as a toy. Man, I hate video games. Hey you, would you like to buy our video game console? No, I hate video games. Oh, did I say video game console? I meant, entertainment system. Totally different thing. I don't know. It sounds a bit like a video game console. I'm not sure about it. If you buy it, we'll throw in a free robot. Sold! And remember Jumpman from earlier? He was renamed to Mario and received a brand new game on the NES, Super Mario Bros. The NES was insanely popular, and a lot of Nintendo's main franchises started on it, like Kirby and Metroid. But, most importantly, in 1989, the Game Boy was released, and although it wasn't very powerful, it was very popular due to being able to play major games like Tetris, Mario, and Zelda wherever you were. In 1998, the Game Boy Color was released, and it's kind of confusing whether it's a separate console or just another version of the original Game Boy. It has a lot of games that can only be played on the Game Boy Color, but most of its major games can be played on the original Game Boy. In 1990, Nintendo released their next console, the SNES or the Super Famicom in Japan. The SNES took what worked about NES games and tweaked and enhanced them to create some of the greatest games of all time. In 1990, 1996, the Nintendo 64 released, and with it, Super Mario 64. Super Mario 64 is one of the most important games of all time, as it was one of the first ever 3D games. It completely changed how 3D games are made. Little stuff like camera control we take for granted nowadays came from Super Mario 64. In 1998, Nintendo released one of the most important games of all time. I'm talking about Hey You Pikachu, of course.
Pikachu! Pika!
Oh, hey, what do you know? This game's bad. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time due to how much it impacted games. This was still at the early point of 3D games, so a lot of the major systems in almost every game today weren't invented yet, and Ocarina of Time was the game that invented them. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, which came out over 18 years after Ocarina of Time, still uses a lot of the systems that were first in Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time is the highest rated game of all time, and it is truly well deserved. Even though the N64 had some of the greatest games of all time, it didn't do too well, because it just had to use cartridges. And that is one of Nintendo's biggest mistakes. The N64's biggest competition, the PlayStation 1, used CDs, and CDs can hold so much more data than cartridges. This meant that major games at the time just couldn't be brought to N64, so the PlayStation 1 did so much better than the N64. But luckily, Nintendo's next console, the GameCube, fixed this problem. I can't wait to play my GameCube game with Dip! Nintendo? What is this? So Nintendo finally decided to make a console with discs, and they're this small! DVDs were getting popular at the time, and the PlayStation 2 worked as a DVD player, which got a lot of people who weren't interested in games to buy a PS2. DVDs could have been a huge selling point for the GameCube, but they just had to use the tiny discs. So again, Sony beat Nintendo. Now how am I supposed to watch Shrek? But hey, at least I don't have to watch these two movies. The GameCube had some great games, but just completely failed next to the PS2, and the PlayStation 2 ended up becoming the best-selling console of all time. Nintendo made most of the money during the GameCube era with the Game Boy Advance, and the Game Boy Advance was insanely popular, but for some reason, Nintendo replaced it only a few years later with the DS. A few years after the DS came out, Nintendo's next home console came out, the Wii, and the DS and Wii were insanely popular because they focused on the casuals. The DS used the touchscreen to control games, and the Wii used the Wii Remote, a motion controller. Instead of hitting buttons for a lot of actions in the game, you just swung the remote. This meant that all people could enjoy games. You didn't have to know how to use a controller, you just touched the screen and swung the remote. It meant that the DS and the Wii were popular with a lot of people who don't normally play video games. Even though the Wii and DS were really successful, they didn't go over well with a lot of Nintendo fans. They were upset because Nintendo was mainly focusing on making games for casual players, and didn't make as much for Nintendo fans. There were still great games for Nintendo fans on the console. The Mario Galaxy game, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Mario Kart Wii, Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, but it didn't help that half their games were Wii Play, Wii Music, Wii Fit, Wii Chess. After the DS and Wii did so well, for their next two consoles, Nintendo tried a similar thing, and it didn't really work out. The 3DS was the same thing as the DS, but in 3D. The effect doesn't work very well on camera, but in person it's pretty cool. The problem is, that's all it is. It's a cool thing you look at every once in a while and think, oh, that's cool, and then never use again. And the Wii U's gimmick is that the controller has a screen. It's kind of weird. The Wii U is Nintendo's worst performing console ever. Besides this weird thing. The Virtual Boy was released in 1995, and I didn't mention it because talking about it is just a waste of energy. The most notable thing the Virtual Boy ever did is exist. The Wii U did terribly, and there's a few main reasons why. 1, they focused way too much on the controller. When the Wii U was first announced, they kept saying, new controller this, new controller that. They never mentioned once that it was a brand new console. So, people just assumed it was just a new controller for the Wii. Number 2, Nintendo mainly marketed the Wii U towards little kids, which a lot of Nintendo fans are older than them.
Whoshi! It's a double Yoshi Exploshi!
Number 3, because the Wii U did so badly, third-party companies wouldn't want to put their games on there, meaning most of the Wii U games are Nintendo's games, and Nintendo just can't make enough games to support the Wii U. There are many more reasons why the Wii U failed, but those are the main 3. At first, the 3DS didn't do too well either, but it ended up receiving a price cut from $250 to $170 in these two games, and the 3DS ended up becoming really successful. The 3DS carried Nintendo through the Wii U era. If it wasn't for that, they may not even be around today. The Switch released in 2017 after Nintendo realized that they needed something other than the Wii U, and fast. The Switch's gimmick is that you can have the console connected to a TV, and then you can take it out and play it in handheld mode. The Switch launched with only 5 physical games and only 9 games in total, and none of them were too major, except for one. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Is a masterpiece. Zelda games after Ocarina of Time had been following the same formula, and while the games were still good, it was pretty obvious they needed a shake-up, and that's what Breath of the Wild was designed to do. Rethink the conventions of the Zelda series, and it succeeded. It is one of the greatest games of all time, and I highly encourage everyone gives it a try. The game has set a standard for open world games, and is one of the most influential games of all time. Okay, we're gonna need to speedrun the rest of this. 2018, major game that year, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate heavily relies on Smash for Wii, 3DS, and Wii U, so to make up for it, includes every single fighter ever in Smash history. 2019, major games are Pokemon Sword and Shield. Very controversial because they don't have all the Pokemon in them. Half the Pokemon community likes them, half doesn't. It's a mess. Animal Crossing comes out in March 2020. Perfect timing because, I don't know if you know this, there was a bit of a global pandemic going on. It did incredibly well because tons of people were buying it for something to do during quarantine. Later in 2020, Nintendo released Super Mario 3D All-Stars, a collection of 3D Mario games. People were mad because it's a collection of old games that they're charging $60 for, and at the end of March 2021, the games went away and you can't buy them anymore. February 2021, we finally get a new Nintendo Direct. Nintendo Directs are videos that show off a bunch of trailers, and we hadn't gotten one in over a year. The major game announced in it is that The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword would be coming to Switch. People were mad because it's a Wii game they sold for $20, now on the Switch for $60. And that is the entire history of Nintendo. I'm exhausted. You may have noticed that I was a bit negative towards Nintendo in this video. Whether it was me complaining about how they refuse to use CDs, or how they keep charging $60 for old games, or the Wii U in general, but there's one reason that, after all that, I still love Nintendo. And that's that they make incredible games. From the first Mario game in 1985 all the way to Animal Crossing New Horizons in 2020, they've always made incredible games. There's a reason that people still play Nintendo games that came out over 20 years ago, and that's because they're great games. Video games are a form of art, and Nintendo have created some of the greatest games of all time. Video games are a way to connect with other people, or express your creativity, or just relieve some stress after a hard day. Video games are very important in how I've met some of my greatest friends to this day. And the company that has created some of my favorite video games of all time is Nintendo.